coming to silence on the... Still a few empty seats.
So welcome everyone to the Quarry White House Auditorium, and also everyone joining us online. You're all very welcome indeed to this Selwyn College event. And you probably don't need me to tell you, I'm sure you don't, that every morning now, every day, we seem to wake up to distressing headlines. And in particular in the last year in the Middle East, the cycle of violence which began with the mass murder and hostage taking on the 7th of October last year. And then today, the Hamas Health Ministry saying that 43,000 people have been killed in the Gaza Strip in the subsequent conflict. And more widely, the conflict in Ukraine still continuing, tension over Taiwan, and relatively unreported, the civil war in Sudan, 15,000 people killed there, and more than 8 million people displaced. And of course, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we all hoped there might be a new world order. And the question tonight is, are we seeing instead a new world disorder? And we're very keen to hear from our excellent guest tonight, Mark Urban, who is a better guide than there could ever be to that kind of world, and also to hear from you with your questions. And Mark and I were talking on the way over about his experience, both more than 3 decades in the BBC, at one point as a Middle East correspondent, as a great defence and diplomatic expert on Newsnight, a Newsnight presenter, and now working for the Sunday Times. And Mark was there in the first Gulf War, in Kosovo, and lots of the other world's trouble spots. So he will guide us tonight through the world as it is now emerging. So, Mark, what I'd like to do, if I can, in the conversation between you and me before we bring in the audience, is start with recent developments and then pull back a bit to that broader picture. So what happened last weekend were Israeli strikes on Iran. And since then, nothing has happened. But are we now seeing the end of this particular cycle of retaliation between Israel and Iran?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you, welcome, and I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for asking me, Roger. It looks that way, and we're in a situation where the Israelis have struck in such a way as to, I think, stay within the parameters which the Americans wanted, and also not present the Iranian government with such a kind of either loss of innocent life or of economic facilities or of nuclear facilities that they would feel obliged to come back. From the military point of view, it was an extremely well executed operation in the sense that everybody knows that Iran had been expecting the Israelis to attack for many years, just as they'd been thinking about it for many years. So the Iranians had been thinking about how are we going to stop them doing this to us. And so they'd invested big in state-of-the-art Russian air defences, anti-aircraft missiles, all this kind of thing, multi-layered to cover all the different possible threats, and invested many billions in that. And obviously, it was a vital matter for Iran to be able to defend itself should this situation arise. Instead of which, what we see is that Israelis mounted a pretty large-scale operation. I think it's a moot point whether any manned Israeli aircraft actually entered Iranian airspace. It's an interesting point. Certainly drones and other things did, but they had sufficient range on all the weaponry that they used to do this from a distance, so over Syria or Iraq. And that's what they did. They stripped away a great layer of air defense, and then they attacked lots of other targets, including the missile engine production factory, which we were talking about before, may well have been agreed with the Americans as a target because it's also making engines for missiles that Iran has been selling to Russia to fire at Ukraine. So in a sense, they were doing the Americans a solid as well by doing that. Now, I have seen people say, a very respected Middle East analyst at the IISS, the Institute for Strategic Studies, saying that it was so successful that he worries that it's kind of lowered the threshold for Israel to use force again against Iran if it wants to. It's an interesting argument. One thing I think is for sure, which is that when Iran fired missiles and drones at Israel in April, they reacted, this was the take the win moment that Biden said to them. They reacted in a very symbolic way. They effectively used one of these long-range missiles to destroy the radar of one of these Russian-supplied anti-aircraft missile systems. What were they doing? They were sending a signal. On Saturday night, they destroyed a load of those radars and all the accompanying elements of that system, missile launchers and command vehicles and all the rest of it. But they also did one other thing. They punched a hole in an empty oil storage tank at the Abadan refinery. So just as they sent a signal in April, here's what to expect next time, they sent a signal on Saturday night about the oil export facility at Abadan. So we understand in a way why they did that. It's to say, don't come back at us, because Iran had said it would bomb Tel Aviv and all sorts of other places. But has it lowered the threshold? So I think the short answer, Roger, is this probably is it for the time being. But have we seen an event which is so asymmetric in a way, in terms of no Israeli aircraft lost, certainly nothing like the prospect of, say, a captured Israeli pilot being paraded in Tehran? Imagine the very different information warfare dynamics if they'd lost planes over Iran or something like that. Nothing like that, and yet they've achieved the targets they wanted to, or so we believe. So yes, it's over for the moment. And the other, I suppose, downstream decision-making point is for Iran. Does Iran conclude that, having spent years thinking about this moment and what would happen, that all its calculations, which is firstly that Hezbollah would deter Israel from doing it because it could pour rockets onto northern Israel, and secondly that they have sufficiently strong defences, having been routed in all those calculations, does Iran now say, come on, we need to move quickly towards a nuclear weapon because nothing else is going to work anymore?
Do we now know more about Israel's military strategy? Because clearly they would see themselves as fighting on multiple fronts against Hamas, against Hezbollah, against Iran, against other forces in the region. And there has been some suggestion that what actually Israel was trying to do was go for total military victory. Do you now see an emerging military strategy that does fit into some sort of long-term plan from Israel?
I think a lot. I have interviewed Benjamin Netanyahu a couple of times, and I mean, it is like trying to nail a jelly to the wall. And a lot of people have commented, anyone less capable of strategic thought. I mean, he's a master manoeuvrer and tactician, but a lot of people have said, what on earth does he think he's achieving in Gaza, for example? And we'll come to that because it's a central question, I think. It is true that if one thinks of strategy in a broad sense, in the way it used to be practiced in Europe in the 19th century or the first half of the 20th century, there appears to be evidence of a strategy in that in the days immediately after the 7th of October, they were really frightened that Hezbollah would come at them at the same time as Hamas. It didn't. So they paused the Hezbollah issue until they were good and ready, then switched their resources there, and have now switched their attention, probably temporarily, to Iran. So it's almost like a sequential dealing with threats, which was clearly going to be much better from their point of view for them than it was for their adversaries, to take those adversaries in turn, in sequence. But I think you come back to the underlying fundamental problem, which is that Benjamin Netanyahu does not seem to have a credible strategy for Gaza. Everybody expected retaliation and expected them to try and destroy Hamas as a military organization. The Israeli military has, on a number of occasions in the last couple of months, released its assessment that Hamas has been destroyed as a military organization in Gaza. So what is the purpose of continuing? Well, we understand about the hostages, but it's not clear if suddenly Hamas were tomorrow to say they would release the hostages. Would that be sufficient to end it? We don't really know. And we don't really know exactly what Netanyahu's intentions are. We've heard these stories about the plan to depopulate the northern part of the Gaza Strip, the plan to create these sort of avenues for operations which effectively cut it up and leave it as a sort of subdivided territory even after the ceasefire, all of which, I mean, runs completely counter to everything the Americans, the Brits, every ally and not so friendly country have said in terms of don't do it. Will they be doing all of those things? I mean, possibly we'll see things clarify if Kamala Harris wins the election.
But the position we're now in Gaza, the figures from the Hamas organisation obviously have to be taken with some scepticism, but they are saying 43,000 dead. And we've heard today that Israel is now talking about banning UNRWA from operating in the Gaza Strip, which means apparently people will not have food. Doesn't this create a legacy of hatred which is going to bedevil the Middle East for as far as you can see?
Yeah, I mean, well, how can it do otherwise? In a sense, I think if you were to be grilling a sort of Israeli national security advisor here rather than me, I think what they would say is, so how would you describe the mindset of those individuals on the 6th of October who were about to come over the next day? Were they reconciled to Israel's existence? Were they? So I think most of them, I mean, most of the Israeli securocrats that I've, interviewed and spoken to over the years, they tend to regard it as a sort of lost cause, that they don't have the ability to influence opinion in the Arab street in a positive direction. And at that point, it's all negative. I mean, clearly the people who came over on the 7th of October behaving in a homicidal fashion, carrying out rape and everything else that they did, were clearly people with a very deep hatred of those that they encountered. And that's their calculation. Their calculation is that, well, it's already kind of as bad as it can be. But that is obviously a counsel of despair. And look, I think one of the questions, we were talking about it briefly on the way over, is how on earth in this situation do you somehow get a viable peace process going again? And it's a big ask for Palestinians as well as Israelis. I mean, when I was reporting there, it was in this extraordinary period of optimism. I was literally appointed like 2 weeks after the Oslo peace agreements were signed. There was a shake of the hands between Arafat and Rabin on the White House lawn. And so I was there in what was a relatively optimistic time. There seemed to be a roadmap to a two-state solution. The Israeli army withdrew from various areas. The Palestinian Authority came in with armed, security forces. Arafat came back. There was a peace treaty with Jordan. There were lots of positive indicators. But what I also had to do when I was there at that time was go to a number of suicide bus bombings. I mean, the sort of moments in which my time as a correspondent there were initially defined were by Hamas bus bombings and by the murder of people in a mosque in Hebron by a Jewish settler from Kiryat Arba, a guy called Baruch Goldstein, who Yitzhak Rabin in the Knesset described as a terrorist. And at that time, it was very clear who the kind of enemies of that process were. Hamas on the one hand and the militant settler right on the other. And of course, we now see that they are in power, as it were, in Gaza and as coalition partners on the Israeli right. So it's hard to be optimistic as long as those two forces are still in the driving seat.
I'm sure we'll come back to the Middle East when we come to audience questions, but let's move to Ukraine. Is it now a stalemate?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a stalemate for quite a while. And I think we are at a point where both sides are having considerable difficulty sustaining the war. And if you ask, well, what are the elements of sustainment? Well, money, weapons, which I think the debate we've had in Western countries has been too much about weapons and the sort of virility test of, why don't we give this one to you? Critically, people. And the Ukrainians are short of people, and so are the Russians. And hence, we've got the North Koreans sending reinforcements and all sorts of, recruitment of mercenaries from African countries, from all sorts of parts of the world by the Russians, because they are short of people as well as the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainian sort of failure to mobilize comprehensively gets to the heart of the sort of most serious and largely unseen tensions between the Americans or the Brits and the Ukrainians. I had someone say, a Western decision maker, shall we say to me a couple of months ago, if this is the existential crisis that Zelensky says it is, why are there still so many people pouring lattes in Kiev? And there is this sense of frustration, I think, that Zelensky has not more comprehensively mobilized the country, the result of which is that, they're spread very thin. It's a 1,000-kilometre front line, and a lot of the units are, at 20-30% of the strength they should be, which makes it easier for the Russians to gain ground, as they have been doing. So I think those questions are going to come home with a vengeance in the next few weeks, actually. Obviously, if Trump is elected, it's pretty clearly a very bad moment for Zelensky and Ukraine. It's not necessarily the cataclysm that, some may have painted it as, but it may be. It's very hard to predict. But I think even if Kamala Harris gets it, there's probably going to be some very difficult conversations. I mean, I have heard for the first time, once again in the last couple of months, one or two people saying things about, is Zelensky now an obstacle? Wouldn't it be right to have an election in spring in Ukraine? They postponed having an election this year. His refusal to talk to Putin under any circumstances is an issue now. So we're starting to get the really difficult conversations happening, I think, among Western allies and with Ukraine.
You explain very well a disillusionment with Zelensky. Is there also, though, just a sense, probably strongly in Russia, that in the end Europe and the EU doesn't care enough about Ukraine, and therefore, although you have reservations about just putting military supplies in, that actually the rise of far-right parties in Europe, the equivocations in Germany are actually also damaging a kind of collective response?
Yes. Well, Germany, listen, when you say you have reservations, you mean presumably the West. You're characterising. Yeah. Look, the in this sort of debate that oscillated back and forth over the last nearly, whatever it is, 2 3/4 years, about weapons, there was always, as a kind of subject matter expert, there was always this thing about, I would be going, what do you mean? When they would talk about a certain category, we've only got 200 of those, that type of missile. So there was the question of political will and political confidence, like the deep targeting question. And then there was a question of, have we actually got any left? And because the magazine depth, as they call it, in Western countries is so shallow, particularly countries like Germany, there are so few of these things, that there was a reluctance among the military to send some of these weapons. So I'm sure Putin was always banking on that eventually sort of military conservatism in the Pentagon would lead to a sort of pinch being put on, which is kind of what's happened in the last 6 months. In the end, though, Putin's, although he's succeeded in some aspects of his defence industry in scaling up production missiles, particularly in drones, he's got limits too. And so this kind of, I can wait you out, Europe is weak. I don't know. I think there could be a mutual advantage. I don't think either side clearly has delivered any kind of decisive result on the battlefield this year. And
is there an inevitable solution, which is the ceding of some territory and then a territorially protected Ukraine?
Yes. I don't think ceding, because I don't think a Ukrainian leader can accept the loss of sovereignty over that. But it's a de facto recognition. There was a curious lunch in the FT 2 weeks ago with the outgoing Secretary General of NATO. And halfway down the article, he says, it'll all come to a head soon after the American election. Oh, okay. And he said, Zelensky will basically be told, sorry, but it's time to, have a serious conversation. And he will ask for security guarantees, which we should give him. but those will not extend to the east of the country. So in other words, if it's something like NATO membership or some kind of guarantee, some line is drawn on the map, and that is a de facto recognition of Russian gains. I think it could have some other aspects to it. I'm, kite flying here, but Zelensky himself has talked about disengagement zones, which he wants, for example, for the security of Kharkiv, the city. It's so close to the Russian border that he wants to try and get the Russian artillery back a bit. But if that concept came of demilitarization extensively, you could also present that as being the Russians pulling back in certain areas, which possibly, in terms of de facto control, gives Zelensky some kind of political cover. But no one underestimates the difficulties for him of that moment. If Stoltenberg is right, the NATO guy, and they're about to have that conversation. But yeah, the package is, you accept this. This is what Stoltenberg was saying. It's not the urban peace plan. But you accept this. We will give you security guarantees, but they won't apply to the east and to Crimea. And then we'll also help you really build up your defence industries, etc., train your armies so that in that narrative of, but Putin would just come back again in 3 years, that you're really well prepared for that situation.
So you mentioned a couple of times the election going on in America at the moment, and we will have a panel on that next week, actually. But is it going to make any difference? I mean, clearly in US domestic politics, the difference between Trump and Harris is an enormous one. In foreign policy, although Trump makes loud noises, would you actually be expecting some continuity, or is Ukraine an example of where Trump is just going to go in a completely different direction?
It's so hard to know, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the campaign trail, it's another thing we were talking about before we came over. I mean, if you look at the campaign trail language in 2016, oh yeah, we're going to build the wall, and we're going to make Mexico pay for it, and we're going to lock Hillary up, and we're going to throw out hundreds of thousands of immigrants. I mean, lots of things which haven't happened or didn't happen during the 2016 to 20 administration. So you sort of think to yourself, well, okay, do we take in deadly earnest some of the things he's been saying recently, or would we be foolish not to, or do we just accept that there's an awful lot of political flummery in his alt-right form of it on the campaign trail? I was asked the other day, now this is a curious thing if we talk about the axis of autocracy, so this is this new concern in London, Paris, wherever, about the alignment of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And the Times said, we want you to do Harris wins, Biden wins. It's a video that they haven't yet posted, and I went through them all, and I went through the implications for Iran. Now, clearly, then Russia, China, North Korea, they're very different. So I mean, clearly for Iran, it's a complete disaster, I think, if Trump gets in. Because one of the things he has been saying is, the Israelis should go for their nuclear facilities straight away. And we know from his previous administration's policy towards Iran, in which he killed the Republican Guard commander Qasem Soleimani, that Trump is very hawkish on Iran and believes that they need to be checked by vigorous military means. Then you get to Russia. Well, of course, they might well welcome a Trump presidency, and China, well, no, that probably means a trade war. So they don't want a Trump president. It's very curious. And North Korea, well, he claimed to have this beautiful friendship with Kim Jong-un during the first term, which slightly embarrassed him because it didn't yield anything. But, did it stop the Korean situation becoming more serious? Who knows? So, when you try and look across the board, it's so haphazard. I mean, one of the things Putin has said is, he's sort of claimed at times that he favours a Harris presidency because it's too unpredictable with Trump. Who knows? People assume he's gaming it and say, no, of course he wants Trump. But who knows?
So it takes us to that wider world question, and you talk about that potential link between Russia and China and Iran and North Korea, which I suppose is the new axis of evil, to use that old George Bush phrase. First of all, how real does that feel? And secondly, if you did have a Trump presidency, does the world become very dangerous? I think we all feel at the moment unsettled, and there are big dangers out there. Are we into potentially a spiral that could be on the very high end of danger?
Well, I think you are I think you're at the high end of danger if, for example, Trump wakes up one morning and decides to go to war with Iran. I mean, I don't think that's very likely that he would just, want to embroil America in that just on a whim. But come back to what we were just discussing before. What if Iran takes the conclusion from what's been happening in the last few months that it really ought to proceed to weaponization of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, as soon as. I think we understand things well enough to know, that the Israelis would probably become aware of that decision being taken quite quickly. And then the new president, whoever it is, would be faced with a choice of, I think it's been well understood in the region that Israel would not attempt to do that mission on its own, and that it will be a joint US-led, and possibly with British and French involvement as well, a wider coalition operation to have a go at the Iranian nuclear capability. So then, obviously we're in dangerous territory, particularly if China or Russia were to say, whoa, hang on, these are our friends. We don't know that they would. Russia kind of sat on its hands at the weekend, didn't do much or say much about Israel's strike. We don't know that they would, but there's the potential for danger. I mean, one of the things which I think has become evident during the war in Ukraine is that, I'm going to give you a perverse ray of optimism here, Roger, is that war of the kind that we think of in the Blitz sense of, the total war, 1940s, is not possible. Firstly, because the Western countries, to a large extent, have disarmed themselves. They don't really have any substantial ability to sustain any kind of conflict for more than a few days, literally, in the case of the UK and France, for example. So we can't actually fight a Third World War. I mean, we'll just be on the receiving end potentially, but we can't really. And even those countries like China and Russia, we've seen the difficulty. So, for example, I was said about Russia increasing its production of missiles, but the Russian attempts to increase the production of tanks, 4,000 of which they've lost in Ukraine, have been really problematic because of all the sub-assemblies and chips and components and bits you need in that system. They've had real trouble. So they were making, I think, about 100 tanks a year when they invaded, and they're now trying to get it to 400. Well, they've lost 4,000. So does any society now have the ability to sustain war in that intense, the way we think of when we talk about the Second World War, sustained, massive application of violence across societies, the idea that, out of this part of England, 1,000 bombers would go and strike Germany. You'd have 1,000 bomber raid. And in 2011, when the RAF wanted to strike Libya from Marham, they got 6 jets up, 2 of which went unserviceable during the flight. So they struck Libya with 4 jets. That's it. The modern British equivalent of Bomber Harris, so a strike over distance, a couple of thousand miles away, is 4 planes. So are we heading for Third World War in the sense that no. But are we perhaps with Israel and Iran, where, let's face it, Israelis, even before the 7th of October, Israeli strikes on missile deliveries to Hezbollah, things like that, hitting Beirut, Damascus airport when missiles were going. These had become almost routine. We'd stopped noticing them. But a constant low level of violence, interstate violence and violence with non-state groups like the Houthis, then yes, I think we are. That's the disorder that we're talking about.
It's going to be a final question from me, and then I'd like to bring in the audience, so please get your questions ready. That question is actually about reporting, because you were in the BBC for 35 years, and the BBC, when I was in the BBC, was seen as being the truth and the facts and all the rest of it. In a world which is fracturing and with journalism under attack as never before and alternative facts, does the BBC, does public broadcasting still have a role in helping us through these conflicts? Or is it not believed anymore?
First thing, yes, I still adhere to the BBC boilerplate. You know, there's never been a more important and essential time for there to be an impartial news source, and yes, I think the BBC struggles, to the best of its ability to play that role, and generally does it pretty well. But the interesting question is that question about, there's when you go to work there's this Orwell quotation on the wall about, the freedom, I think, is the right to tell people things they don't want to hear, something like that. And oh my Lord, has there ever been a more apposite, quote for our age? I mean, I find the refusal of people to listen to stuff they don't want to hear is clearly one of the big trends of the last 10, 15 years. Some people put it down to populism. I mean, it's all sorts of political forces. There have been moments when I thought, okay, that's it. Now the BBC, we've lost the Scottish Nats, whatever. They're all piling in on Nick Robinson, organising a petition to try and get... And we're talking about 2014 here. Then, of course, Brexit, we all understand that, that there was a section of the population that felt, no, it was all, pro-Brussels or whatever. And equally, since then, the section that thinks we allowed too many lies to go unchallenged, all that sort of stuff. COVID, of course, a lot of division. I mean, what concerns me about it, I guess, is that section of the population which, when I went into the BBC, the section of the population which I would have called the sensible centre. So we basically agree about something like the cost of living or the unemployment rate or the size of the UK deficit, but we disagree about what the answer is. So the answer might be a Labour Party answer or a Liberal, or a Tory answer. And the only people who weren't, the 5% on each side were like the British National Party and the CPGB or the Trots or one or two other very small marginal political forces. I would say the sensible centre is now around 50%. Both edges have come right in, and substantial proportions of people now just don't accept those basic facts. And, they'll say, well, that's only because, the OBR is dominated by the left or the right or whatever. Yeah, that's the only reason why we think the economy is doing this. And you now get into this argument about the underlying facts. And that is very, very tricky, I think, for the BBC. It's very hard to still have that case, that you're speaking to the nation as a whole. And yes, okay, it's still the central 50% is still a critical mass of people, and there's still very substantial audiences. But I think it is very hard. I mean, the unwillingness of people to hear stuff they don't want to hear. I mean, I'll give you a small example, because I think this gets to telling you things you don't want to hear, which is I did this. I was presenting Newsnight one night, and there was a big story out about the price of eggs, and Tesco didn't have any more eggs, and various other places ran out of eggs. So suddenly we get offered the managing director of Waitrose. Now I was a great believer in getting people like that on, because I would argue that putting on sort of third-rate backbenchers or whatever rarely is putting someone on who affects the life of the viewer or listener. Whereas someone who runs a big supermarket, and there's all sorts of categories of people who never go on. They might be High Court judges, they might be regulators, who actually affect your life in much more direct ways. So I thought, let's get the head of Waitrose on. Brilliant. Now, of course, he comes on because corporately he's got a good story to tell. There's loads of eggs in Waitrose, because they've instituted this new scheme to pay British farmers extra. During the course of this interview, he makes a very convincing case that, and these are the words you may not want to hear, it's nothing to do with Brexit. And he says, and I ask him this question because people will always tweet whatever, you didn't mention the elephant in the room. So I say, ask him a very open question about Brexit. So it's the problem that they can't get the eggs from Spain or whatever. He said, no, it's entirely about price. We pay more, we've got eggs. Tesco's, it's all about price. They don't pay enough, they haven't got eggs. That was basically his argument. So I then find myself being flamed on social media. And I look at some of these people attacking me, and it's like, professor of oncology at such and such. I mean, these highly educated people who just will not accept what this bloke has said. And I'm thinking, look, I mean, if we've lost this lot, we're really in trouble, Our most kind of educated viewers, because they just didn't want to accept that it was nothing to do with Brexit. Anyway.
I'm looking at medical professors who are on Twitter. Questions, please. Yes, there in the. Just wait, Tissat will get the gentleman in the white and stripy T-shirt.
Oh gosh.
Okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So we spent a lot of time discussing Israel and Palestine, Ukraine, but one thing that we don't talk about much is Sudan.
Yeah.
It's always been nicknamed the Forgotten War. I just wondered what you thought might be happening, if you could explain it a bit to anyone here that's not fully aware, or what might happen in the future with Sudan. Thanks.
Yeah, well, it's a good question because you're exposing my ignorance. I've never been to Sudan, so it's not like one of the places I've been talking about where I'm staying within a certain kind of comfort zone of long-term reporting. But in essence, yeah, you have competing warlords, and increasingly you have states that want to act as proxies, like the UAE or Egypt, or in some ways Russia. They've all become involved in backing one side or another. And yeah, I mean, the humanitarian consequences are catastrophic. Roger, you mentioned 8 million. I don't know if it's maybe even more than that people have been displaced. I mean, it is interesting, as to why it doesn't rank higher in the news values or our scheme of things. Possibly we've just got overloaded. I mean, one heroic exception to that is Lindsay Hilsum on Channel 4 News, who's tried to do quite a lot of reporting from Sudan. But yeah, that all I can tell you is it's essentially a civil war with proxy involvement, and things we've seen elsewhere. Similar things happened in Libya and still happen in Libya, in the sense that you've got Turkey, Qatar, you've got various countries and Russia all trying to back the rival sides and either get access to strategic minerals. It's not the case in Sudan, it is the case in Libya, or just see their own clients prevail. And I guess, it's one of those ungoverned spaces. The thing that really scares me, and I don't know if it's appeared on your radar, is this saber rattling between Ethiopia and Somaliland. So Ethiopia wants its sea access back, essentially, and is threatening to go to war with Somaliland. And once again, that would be a whole regional conflict in which various other actors would get involved, and would be in humanitarian terms an absolute disaster, as the war in Tigray was that they fought 2 years ago. So yeah, there's a lot of conflict in Africa. It's very little reported. There are a lot of things that we would say violate international humanitarian law, and by and large, it goes unreported.
More questions, please. Yes, gentleman there in the dark pullover. Yeah. Fantastic.
This is a bit more in your comfort zone. So I was interested in your observations about how the technology of fighting wars has changed. So I was kind of struck by your comment about the fact that the Russians lost a lot of main battle tanks, and sometimes to technology that's available off the shelf for a couple of £100. Have you got any sort of observations around that? And do you think it has any ramifications for the UK Strategic Defence Review that's underway at the moment?
I mean, one of the interesting things is that people in a desperate condition, faced with desperate circumstances, it might be Ukrainians, it might have been Palestinians in certain situations, but will come up with a level of ingenuity that is clearly, and an ability to do things quickly, completely impossible for our kind of sclerotic defence procurement bureaucracies in Western countries. I mean, I heard a very good story someone told me about the Russian drone industry, which, bizarrely, so you'd think Russia, full of corruption, all of Vlad's mates, taking their percentage. But they've been very effective at producing drones and getting the numbers up very, very quickly. And I heard an extraordinary story that basically the Russians were caught out buying thousands and thousands of things that go in the rear bumper of your Audi, apparently. I don't know why it was just Audis, but make the tonal noise when you're getting near the back of the garage or whatever, or close to for use as proximity devices on warheads of drones. So basically, they'd realised there was a dual-use technology that would be relatively light touch on sanctions, and that they could order thousands of these reversing proximity indicators and use them to make proximity warheads for their drones. So there is a lot of ingenious, I mean, it's the old story, I guess, man killing man manages to come up with all kinds of sort of twisted ingenuity and solutions to how to do it more and more effectively and lethally. I mean, imagine a situation in which you have all these drones, which now you see hunting people in the most shocking videos. I don't know if you ever watch these on social media, but there's a lot of pretty ghastly videos around of people sort of running and pleading, and then match that to something like facial recognition software. I mean, how far off that are we? Not too far, I wouldn't think. So your question was about Western and what we can do. I had a guy, and he will probably have some very small voice. He's a British officer who told me that he was a liaison officer who was developing stuff for the Brits, like military industry, to feed into Ukrainian military. And he went on a tour of the drone factory and said that basically they've got a 6-week cycle there. That for each innovation they make, they reckon they've got about 6 weeks until the Russians come up with a countermeasure. And he turned to me and he said, "I'm lucky if I can get something into service in 6 years in this country." And that's the problem. That's the problem. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, it may be you apply the kind of techniques of startups and some of the tech world stuff to this technology and say, off you go, guys. We're just gonna have a competition for someone to develop X, Y, and Z loitering munition or something, whatever it is. But it's a huge problem. I mean, one of the things I've spoken about or written about recently is this, the incoming missiles versus how you defend against them and the cost imbalance. So the Ukrainians, people often cite these Russian drones that cost $50,000. Well, they cost a bit more than that, the Iranian designed ones. And they say, they fired this missile. But generally they bring those down with guns, like old school anti-aircraft guns, and they shoot them down. But they do fire Patriot missiles at faster, harder targets that are coming in, ballistic missiles and things. Each one of these Patriot missiles, to buy the new one, is $5 million. I remember seeing a figure in January of 23, so it's quite early on in the war, but when the Russians first started really having a go at the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, the Ukrainians had fired 150 in a month of those Patriots. And that's the issue. When the Iranians hit Israel on the 1st of October, there were some American warships standing off that fired 12 missiles to try and help them defend themselves. Now, those missiles, those 12 missiles, the acquisition cost was $180 million. And they reckon the replacement cost is over $400 million. So there's a basic fundamental sort of structural problem. I mean, yes, it's true, against a target like a ballistic missile, there isn't really a cheap way of doing it. But against all those other things, those little sort of home, like hobbyist drones that get weaponized, and there are lots of other ways of trying to bring them down, which the Ukrainians, of course, devoting all their energies to. As to how much that gets baked into the strategic defence, I'm not an optimist. I mean, I'd like to think they could acquire that kind of agility, but I'm not an optimist.
Okay, we've got about 15 minutes left,
sorry,
so make sure we get questions
I must give shorter answers.
No, we'll go down the front row and the lady in the black here.
And then we have more questions.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll put a stopwatch on my answers to limit myself to...
Thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Not so much about warfare. I wondered if you would care to share your thoughts about the Washington Post not supporting any particular candidate for the election.
Oh, Lord. See, I don't feel as strongly about this as some journalists do. I think, I know people have taken the whole democracy dies in darkness thing and turned it against Bezos, and I guess look, people will, people talk about 200,000 subscriptions cancelled. That's the price it's going to be. I mean, beyond saying he's taken a decision for whatever his reasons are, I think it's so hard with populist leaders like Trump knowing what the best, does your endorsement help or hinder? One of the best conversations I ever had about Trump was I was flying out to do a Trump 100 Days piece, and sitting next to me was this guy. We got chatting. He's an engineer. He builds racing cars. He was a very highly qualified guy, and he makes these Indianapolis racing cars. And so we get talking. Eventually, it emerges he voted Trump. So slowly, I'm kind of probing away here, and then to cut it short, so that we can get more questions in. The crystallisation of his position was, I thought anyone who annoys East Coast liberals that much must be worth a vote. That's what he said. So I mean, that's part of the sort of wacky dynamics of culture wars American style, isn't it? And Pete Buttigieg said about the racist comedian at the event, look, don't take the bait. This is just sort of the equivalent of a dead cat to stop us talking about why Kamala is a better, And it's that constant dilemma, isn't it? Do you actually call it out to use that, or do you actually say, no, I'm not going to allow my, whether it's whatever it is, a proprietor to be determined by, I don't know.
Okay, more questions, please.
Hard
Loads
to
of
get
hands
a
going
perfect
up.
answer to
We'll go to the gentleman
I'm
with
going to
the...
try and limit myself. I'm going to be very strict.
Off a jacket or with red? Yeah, okay. All right, okay. Just hold the
A
microphone.
reversible red and blue.
Okay, hello. So picking up from comments that both of you made about different things. First of all, that the current crisis in Gaza started a year ago and that Netanyahu doesn't really seem to have any kind of strategy. Well, I think many would say that the problems in Gaza started decades ago rather than specifically last year. But more about Netanyahu's strategy. Could it be that his strategy is also decades in the future, as a long-term game, basically to make it inhospitable, let's put it that way, for Palestinians to remain? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think there is the question always about, where does your timeline start in terms of assigning grievance and stuff like that? So another thing I covered was the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. Now, at the time, my view was very positive about this. I thought, hey, you believe in a two-state solution, you're 40% of the way there. These guys, they're going to get self-rule, everything's going to be, they're going to get the Israeli army off their backs. What's negative about that? Now, as I made that film, so I made one film on the Israeli side, as they winkled out the settlers. They bulldozed 22 settlements when they went. And I made one film on the Palestinian side. Now, the Palestinians were largely pessimistic. Now, you think, hang on a minute, Israeli army's going, all the ones who supported Fatah and the Palestinian Authority were, no, this will empower radicalism. Hamas will claim that they chased them out. We're screwed. And lo and behold, within a year and a half they were. And then Hamas was murdering hundreds of members of Fatah after they took control of the Gaza Strip. So I do think in this, one of our issues is we always ascribe agency to Israel and America, but you have to also look at the agency of Iran and Hamas and Fatah. How did what was, in a way, a great opportunity there turn into such a disaster for Palestinians? As for whether or not it's a long-term strategy, I think there's something what you say. I think certainly on the radical Israeli right, of course they know that the policy that used to be called transfer, which is just expelling people, would not, would bring, a very difficult international situation upon them. So yes, I think it's quite likely that there are plenty of them who think in those terms. But equally, you do still have quite a lot of people there who are anti-Netanyahu, and it's a complex polity in Israel, as you know. And
Okay, I'm going to go to the lady next to you, and then we will go over the far side, because quite a few hands up.
Well, I'm close to this.
quick
ask
question, please.
Quick question on China, Taiwan. You mentioned that. I thought I would like to ask you, if theoretically China is going to launch military action in Taiwan, would America, do you think, will help Taiwan defend in the light of who's going to be, the American president? I'd like to hear your prediction and views on that.
Oh, no,
Although
not
I don't think it's
predictions.
going to be, happening
Meg.
very soon.
I'll get an email in 2 years' time when the invasion has happened saying, you said they would never do. Look, I was in Kiev until 5 days before that invasion in February 22. I was quite convinced that the Ukrainians would fight. I was in Taiwan 2 years ago, and I was not convinced. So people, Taiwanese, when you poll them, they have a sort of there's a dualism in their attitude. So if it's what would you like to happen? Unification with China. At the time I was there, the poll said 14% or whatever. Greater independence was 56% or whatever. So it was like, it would seem that there's a strong commitment to an independent. But then, when asked the question, where do you think Taiwan will be in 50 years' time or whatever, there was a strong majority that said unified with China. Now, is that just a sort of fatalism? Is it an expression of an emotional aspiration that people feel the sense of being one nation? And another guy, a disinformation expert, said all of the disinformation that Beijing sends in to this island is designed to short-circuit that gap, to basically make people accept it's inevitable and therefore not to resist it. And it's a natural family reunification, effectively. So, firstly, I don't buy the idea of a sort of D-Day style invasion. I think if there's going to be a big crisis, the crisis takes the form of a blockade, following some act of independent thinking on the part of Taiwan, followed by an ultimatum. Look, to avoid misunderstandings, we should have a PRC liaison office in Taipei to liaise and make sure we don't get to the brink of war again. And that then begins to serve the function that we saw in Hong Kong after the handover, that the liaison office there, and to gradually draw all the political forces towards Beijing. That's how I think it's most likely to end, but don't shout at me if it all goes horribly wrong.
Okay, time for two
Yeah,
more
I'm
questions.
giving
Loads
too
of
long
hands going up.
answers.
Let's go to the gentleman in the green there, and then we'll go to you at the back in the black and brown stripes, I think. Yeah.
Oh, hi, that was great, thank you. From my understanding, China buys almost all of Iran's oil. Do you see that they have a lot of influence on Iran? Like, are they, as the US impacts Israel, are they the kind of other on Iran? Do you think they have influence on Iran's decisions on this escalation kind of cycle?
I think part of, coming back to this notional title of the talk about disorder, I think part of our thinking now has to be, do those types of relationship, client relationships, whatever, exist in quite the same form? So I think a lot of people have said, this is ridiculous. Netanyahu keeps just blowing Biden off and showing out how weak he is. Conversely, you then get the situation like at the weekend, where America seems to have really closely calibrated what those strikes would be. So in each of these relationships, it's a really uncertain situation. There was mention when the Houthis started attacking shipping in the Red Sea. Look, China needs to have a word with Iran. Iran needs to have a word with the Houthis. Well, the linkages at those 2 points, do they work? Well, what happened was the Houthis tried to stop targeting Chinese shipping as it was coming through, and that was their kind of gesture. But I mean, all of those, it's really hard to know. And I think a country like China is very pragmatic in the way it judges those things. But yeah, they do have a very close relationship with Iran. And I think, we haven't much talked about it, but this thing, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, which a year or two ago I would have said is a bit of a kind of weak security conference type talking point, is much more real now. And the more that their sort of economy rewires itself to adjust to the fact that obviously Russian energy isn't going to Western countries anymore, might be going to India, but it's also, you know, more going to China and all the rest of it. And the weapons assistance that Russia has been getting from Iran, North Korea and China, all three of them, suddenly begins to make it feel a bit more real. Although, as I was saying, their different national interests in the US election makes it very hard to say that they have a coherent worldview. It's not like Cold War One, you know, with communism versus. So it's really hard to know whether, I mean, China might well be able to have some influence on Iran, I think, but within limits.
Okay, we'll go to the back row for the final question.
Thank you so much for your time. I'm going to tell you on the US election, given that there's been so much blatant Russian interference in elections in Moldova and I believe in Georgia as well, do you think that's grounds for concern that there'll be any significant Russian interference in the US election? And if there is, what do you think the consequences are of that domestically and or internationally?
Yeah, I mean, often when Trump says stuff about, oh, you know, I'll close down the Ukraine war, instantly, and oh, I wouldn't defend Taiwan, and you know, I think he's literally just saying, come on, interfere, baby, you know, interfere as much as you like, you know, I'm your man. Whereas I'm not sure, you know, Putin is quite that stupid in terms of, you know, as he has said publicly, he regards Trump as very unpredictable. So, yes, I'm sure that they will try. I mean, generally, the pattern that's emerged, and the big players in this, curiously, are Russia, China, and Iran in terms of online disinformation, is they generally just like to stir up social tensions and cause fracturing within Western societies, whether it's along racial or other line, you know, to try and work away without really a coherent view about exactly who they want elected or you know. So yes, I know in 2020 people were very much on the lookout for Russian, you know, bot activity and other stuff that might be trying to influence voters. It's funny, I haven't heard the same warnings this time. They must be, you know, they must be on the lookout for it, but let's see.
I said final question, but there is one thing I want to ask you. You did, of course, present Newsnight for many years, and were on Newsnight for many years. Newsnight is now half an hour and a different format. Do you still, will you rush home tonight to watch Newsnight, or have you lost the habit?
This was going so well, Roger. I do still watch it sometimes. Yeah, it's a different programme, isn't it? I mean, I watched it recently and I thought that was very good. I thought that was a very interesting discussion. And then the theme music started at the end. And I thought, so I felt a pang of pain, you know. I thought it was a very good programme in its own right, but it wasn't Newsnight in the form that, you know, I knew and loved it.
Want to add anything else? Or?
No, I mean, listen, I think they're very pleased with the viewing figures they've got. You know, they're part of taking. I mean, they literally. I'm going to tell you a secret now, because one of the really problematic things I think about the public debate about the BBC is there are very few facts. So in the 30 plus years that I worked on that programme, I don't think more than 5% of the people working on it would have known the budget. People just don't know it. So in that discussion, public discussion, there's almost never figures attached. So when the cuts fell, the budget was just over £8 million. And they took 5 million out. So what you're getting is a 3.5 million or something programme left. And of course, to take 5 million out, obviously you got rid of most of the staff and stopped all the filming and everything else. So it is fundamentally, it's a different proposition. I mean, it succeeds quite well in its own terms. But, maybe, I don't know, do you still call it Newsnight? I don't know.
Okay, before I thank you, Mark, I just want to do a couple of plugs for things we're doing in the next week or so, actually this month. Next week, as I mentioned, we have got an American election panel, which will be on Thursday, the 7th of November in here, with Lauren Wilcox, one of the Selwyn Fellows, who's a political scientist, Professor Brendan Sims from elsewhere in Cambridge, and Tim Montgomery, the founder of Conservative Home. So they will be on a panel on 7th of November. And then on Monday, the 25th of November, we have a panel with Dame Sally Davis talking about antimicrobial resistance, which I think, bringing together the themes of tonight, if wars don't get as well as silent pandemic will, so that will cheer us up before Christmas. But I think she's a distinguished speaker and is actually the UK lead on antimicrobial resistance. So I hope you'll come to that and the American election panel. And a couple of other events we'll publicise as well. And do, as ever, follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, on all the other places. We'll make sure you get all the details of the events. But otherwise, Mark, I thought that was fascinating tonight. Real insights.
And thank you for your questions.
I think we knew that on TV, that you really know your stuff, but when you're given an hour to talk about it, you know your stuff even more, and it's really illuminating.
But maybe not Sudan. But,
well, listen, thank you to everyone who came tonight, but especially thank you, Mark Urban. Thank you very much indeed.